hope you enjoy Addressing Gettysburg's first spin-off show, That's What She Said, a show about women of the Civil War era from Gettysburg and beyond. This show first premiered on Patreon a year ago, and with the help of our patrons, we've developed it over the last 12 months. Did you know that 18 out of 21 phlebotomists agree that listening to Addressing Gettysburg's Patreon shows can help you prepare for the guide exam? If that's not convincing enough, you should hear what 6 out of 6.5 dentists say. It'll blow your mind. So help keep Addressing Gettysburg going and learn a ton, literally a ton, maybe even a metric ton. Wait, is that more? Well, either way, you can learn a lot from the hundreds of episodes we've produced for you over the last 5 years on our Patreon page. Many podcasts have a Patreon account, but only one treats it like a career and gives you something in return every week. And that's ours. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg to join today. First and second lieutenants get every episode we put out each month and then some. We thank you in advance. And now, on with the show.
Okay. All right. Are we ready?
Mark.
Marking again. You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg. Well, yep, we're doing that one too. Stop laughing. All right.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
That's what she said.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg's That's What She Said podcast, the show where we discuss the lives of the women of Gettysburg. I'm Bethany Yingling.
Hi, Bethany. I'm Veronica. Nice to meet you.
Veronica. Nice to meet you, too. So here we are with our first repeat guest, which is, I feel like, a milestone in podcasting hierarchy. Because then we actually did something right and she was willing to
come back. That's true. Yeah.
So, yay.
And if you're a listener, we're also in our new digs. This is the first That's What She Said episode being recorded in the new studio sponsored by the American History Museum and Eric Doer. So thank you to him. And we're excited to have Carolyn Ivanoff back with us.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so Carolyn, we're going to do even though you were here before, we'll do a little intro of who you are because maybe people didn't listen to the first one, which you should, so go back and listen. So Carolyn is an author of a book that has just recently come out here in 2023. We Fought at Gettysburg. It's about the 17th Connecticut. And it is a tome, but it is so cool. I absolutely love it. Definitely buy it because it is a cry book. I'm not going to lie. It's a cry book. Carolyn was the assistant principal at Shelton Intermediate School in Shelton, Connecticut.
And Shelton High School.
Yeah. And named the Civil War... What's BT?
The
Battlefield Trust. Okay,
yeah.
Civil War Battlefield Trust. We'll mark that. She was named the Civil War Battle Trust Preservation Teacher of the Year in 2003 and a member of the Gettysburg Foundation, as everyone should be.
Yes, indeed.
All right, so today, who are we talking about?
We're going to be talking about Clara Barton, who was not specifically at Gettysburg, but was really important female Civil War personality. And perhaps if you look at the span of her career and many of her accomplishments, she may be the most, I'm going to make this statement, she may be one of the most important American women of the 19th century.
I am not going to argue with that at all.
Well, our role is to find out why. So I'm sure you'll, over the next however many minutes here, you'll tell us why.
I will try to explain that if I can. Now, I think she is a force to be reckoned with and a very, very influential woman with regard to our society today and what we have become and what we do, and any of the humanitarian causes that we are supportive of. And we'll talk about how her influence and what she did during Civil War directly affects us here in the 21st century.
Now, we always ask, why did you, Carolyn, choose this topic?
Well, I do a lot of reenacting. Sometimes I really am Clara Barton. But I like a lot of Civil War personalities. And when I'm doing living history, I try to do someone who I feel close to. And I'm not 23 years old anymore. Far from it.
Not
and
that
Clara
far,
Barton,
but still adorable.
Oh yeah, but Clara Barton was 40 years old when the war began. 40 years old in 1861 was much older than middle age. You know, a woman could expect to live 50, 55 years. That was pretty average. So Barton was an older woman. She was very independent. She remained unmarried her entire life. She was somewhat of a radical. She was an extremely radical person, but did not present herself that way. And she was difficult to describe. A lot of her differences with society, because even though she was not the typical 19th century woman by any stretch of the imagination, she presented herself as such. And she was able, by doing so, to just make some monumental accomplishments and contributions to America as we know it, society as we know it today. And she was an extraordinary personality. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the ways she was so different from others of her time. She was absolutely not the typical 19th century woman, or even typical early 20th century personality.
Now, I've wanted to ask you this question for a long time, but I decided to save it for today. Is that intimidating to you, to portray somebody like Clara Barton as a living historian?
If I don't think about it too much, no. You know, she was a highly flawed individual, highly flawed, but she was also this dynamic personality who overcame all of her issues. And by doing so, when we look back at her life from a 21st century perspective, we can say to ourselves, well, this woman was manic depressive. Or maybe this woman was bipolar. But you really can't do that. You should never do that. But there was a terrible strain of depression, monumental depression, that ran through her family and ran through her. And the Library of Congress has digitized so many of her diaries and her papers and her speeches. It's a terrific collection. She had a lot of suicidal ideation. If you read her diaries, she had a lot of feelings of worthlessness, and yet she accomplished so much. And how she did it, the antidote to all that ailed her was work, and it was give everything to help others. And this was the antidote to what ailed her. And this is how she lived her life. And in pursuit of a cause, she could be absolutely manic and single-minded. And the things she accomplished are pretty significant.
Yeah.
So you're talking about. Let me talk about. She's born in Christmas Day, 1821. She is 10 years younger than her youngest sibling, family of 5. Her father was a well-respected man in North Oxford, Massachusetts, and he had been a captain in a militia. She was very, very attached to her father. She was like the apple of his eye. He would sit her down, he'd teach her military history and stories and all kinds of things. Her mother now was another sort entirely. Her mother was an abolitionist, and her mother was in favor of women's suffrage in the 1850s and 60s. So very progressive family. Her mother was also extraordinarily profane. And in the 19th century, women didn't swear like sailors, most of them.
Her mother was extraordinarily
profane. And she had a horrible temper. And look, this is just a story that Clara tells, what Miss Barton tells when she was a child. Her father bought her mother a brand new stove. and her mother was cooking on it and became so disgusted with it because she didn't like the way it heated that she dismantled the entire stove and threw it in the farm pond. So she pitched a little temper. So she was, she never slept a lot. Clara Barton remembers her sleeping just a few hours every night and doing like 2 days' work in one day. It was like she was very, 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 very different from a typical Victorian farm wife from Massachusetts. So this woman was really tough. She had very little time for her daughter, her youngest daughter. So Clara Barton's brothers and sisters really took up the slack. She always related better to adults than children as a result of that. She was somewhat of a prodigy. You know, her brothers taught her all kinds of things. How to ride a horse, hell for leather, with a saddle, without it. She was a typical farm girl. But her sisters were both teachers and taught her how to read at a very early age. She went to school probably about 3.5 years old was her first school experience. She was already reading. She had a significant vocabulary. She becomes the teacher's pet, and she can't relate. She's extremely shy, can't relate to any of the kids, so makes no friends. So this is a very difficult thing for her. She's very shy, very subdued, but when she's home, she's very outgoing. She does a whole bunch of things. She runs through the farm with her male cousins like a little banshee. So she has a really extraordinary upbringing. And this is all going to feed into what she becomes. One of the things she remembers from her childhood, one of her most frightening memories, and she does remember as an old lady who's considered pretty courageous throughout her life, she remembers that as a child she was afraid of everything. She was really afraid of everything. People found that very interesting, knowing her as an adult when she looked back on her childhood. One of the most frightening memories of her life was her older sister, Dorothy, who was a really good teacher. Something happened to her. She was a broken personality, to the point where the family would have to lock her in the room because she would become so violent and so...
Oh, my.
So one day, Dorothy was having an episode and escaped the house and chased her brother David's wife through the yard with an axe, intent on a lot of harm, until... the brother David could disarm her and secure her and get her back into the house. And Dorothy died very, very young. But this is one of the most frightening memories. And the family never talked about this much. It's like when kids witness violence at home and they become very secretive. They don't talk about things outside the house. I don't know if the family ever explored this together, but obviously a memory that really deeply disturbed her.
Did she die of suicide?
No.
No.
She died rather young, and I don't recall ever seeing a reason for her death. Yeah.
Well, in the first 5 minutes of you talking, I have a completely different idea of who Clara Barton was than I ever had in my entire life.
Well, let me talk about her a little more, because it's her childhood experiences set her on a certain path. She doesn't plan to do what she does during the Civil War or afterward. A lot of this just comes to her as she's living a life because she wants to be of service. And that's the foremost thing in her mind that's driving her to do what she does. So her brother, when she's about 10, her brother David, her favorite brother, is at a barn raising, and he falls through the roof of the barn. He falls 2 stories, and he lands on his feet. But he really messes himself up.
I was going to say breaks a leg.
And he didn't, I don't recall he broke anything, but he did a lot of internal stuff that would affect him for the next 2 years. He becomes bedridden for the next 2 years. Clara Barton becomes his nurse. So the doctors come in, they prescribe stuff, leeches, a lot of leeches, a lot of cupping. So she does all this, she handles this, she handles all of his needs for the next 2 years. He ultimately is cured by, as I understand it, some sort of a steam cure. You know, the Victorians were all into the water and steam, and it's a more natural cure than most of the doctors are providing. They're providing a lot of heroic medicine type things like purging and, leeching and cupping and, all of this stuff. None of it does any good, but he's ultimately cured by some kind of a steam cure. Or
Interesting.
Water cure.
I wonder what that would have been.
So I don't know.
And
I
you're
don't
saying
know.
that was...
And she doesn't leave too many details about that I'm aware of. You're going in the 1850s. You're going from the heroic medicine of bleed, blister, and purge, and you're entering this more homeopathic medicine. It's a gentler medicine. It's a more natural medicine as an antidote for a lot of the bleed, blister, and purge that regular doctors are ordering. So, and the Civil War is kind of like on the cusp of this when we go to war. So she doesn't go anywhere for 2 years. She just stays by his bedside. She nurses him. She goes to school for 1 day. When he's finally cured, she has gained, in 2 years, she's gained 1 pound. She hasn't grown in height, and she's been to school 1 day. So her life is kind of on hold except for this focus on her brother and everything for her brother. And his cure, although it makes her very happy, kind of leaves her very much adrift.
And how old was she when this happened?
She was about 10 when he fell and about 12 or 13 when he was finally cured.
Not to grow or...
Yeah.
That's not good.
She and this is all from her, all of the stuff in the Library of Congress. My favorite biographer of her is Elizabeth Brown Pryor. It's called Professional Angel. I like her the best because I think it gives the most rounded picture of her. So now she's maybe 13, 14. She's got to go back to school. She's very shy. She's very introverted, except with family. And her mother's very concerned for her. So this tough, rough woman is like, there's something wrong with this child. I have to do something. So what do you do in the 19th century? You consult a phrenologist. And you have the child, the bumps on the child's head read. And believe it or not, it's the very famous Dr. Fowler who comes to the house. He's very a nationwide celebrity, is a phrenologist. And he reads the bumps on Clara's head. And he says to her mother, throw responsibility at her. She needs to serve others. So he's on to something here. She should be a teacher. So when she's 18 years old, she makes the first dress that she's going to wear for her first day of school. And she goes into public school number 9, I believe, in Massachusetts, where she lives in Worcester County. And she becomes a teacher. And she becomes quite the teacher. She winds up teaching in the roughest schools. She's, people demand her to come to their schools and teach. She wins the district prizes for discipline at her school, and she's kind of outraged because there really is no discipline that she has to provide. She's just a remarkable teacher, and kids take to her, and they I think one school, she had 72 children in one school. Now, kids didn't go to school every day, these one-room schools, and she taught algebra and math and reading and writing and science and chemistry and all kinds of things. And she, their schools are kind of reflective. New England schools are kind of reflective of what they are now. You had immigrants and foreign-born, and English is a second language. They didn't call it that, but that's indeed what it was. Kids were 4 to 22 years old in this school. And she just becomes a remarkable teacher, very much in demand. And most of the time, women taught summer school because it was cheaper. You could get a man through the winter months when most kids came to school, but you had to pay them more. Well, she's in demand for the winter months as well as summer months. And one school district really wants her to come, but they don't want to pay her. And she goes, I may be willing to teach for free, but I will never do a man's work for less than a man's pay. And she, from the very beginning, demands equal pay to a man, and she gets it.
Mic drop is what you call that.
So right there, she's right on the cusp of, what she believes and what she's going to adhere to, and what she's going to do. A lot of the boys that she teaches up in Massachusetts, she's going to see again on the battlefields of the Civil War in different, much different circumstances.
Carolyn, let me interrupt if you don't mind. So, thinking back to my own experiences, like some of the teachers that were highly respected, maybe in retrospect were because they were disciplinarians for whatever. They were a little bit heavy-handed with, not putting up with too much stuff. Other teachers that were highly respected were the ones that kind of just had some way about them to kind of like a calming influence or like just lead by example kind of thing. I mean, where would you think?
I would say she was of the second.
Okay.
She used her writing crop once.
Okay.
And it shocked her and it shocked the entire school. It was a boy who just would not settle down. He was disruptive. And I think what got her, he was disrupting the education of others. And she dealt with it harshly. That was the first and last time she ever used any kind of corporal punishment. I don't think she ever had to. And you're going to see later.
The micro. I'm sorry.
You're going to see later in her life, especially in the Civil War, how she forms these bonds with people to get things done. And kids are no different. She talks to them. She teaches them. They love her. And they're going to remember her. And a couple of boys she treats as wounded men in the Civil War. And they remember her very well. So she makes quite the impression on men and women alike. She one of the things I admire most about her is that she forms these bonds with people to get things done. Nobody uses the old boy network better than Clara Barton. This is a woman of, they're not a rich family. She has no family connections. She's on her own. She's a maiden lady. She forms these. She can't vote. She forms these relationships with powerful men, politicians, senators, generals, and she gets them to do what she needs them to do to accomplish her purposes. That being said, she doesn't form relationships to drop people when the job is done. Mm-hmm. And most of the relationships she forges with the great and powerful last throughout her entire life. And she outlives everyone. So, some of the relationships she forms, she is with their sons and daughters after the fact. But anyway, this is all feeding into what she becomes during the Civil War. So let's talk about the Civil War because she is in Washington, D.C. when the Civil War breaks out at Fort Sumter.
Doing what?
She is working in the patent office. Now, in the 1850s, she went to Washington, D.C., and she got a job in the patent office as a patent clerk. She's one of the first women to work for the federal government, and she gets a man's pay, $1,400 a year in the 1850s, which is pretty remarkable.
Can you tell me why? Why
just all of a sudden?
And teaching?
Well, what happened was she didn't just all of a sudden get there. Her mother dies. She had been trying to go to school for herself, but she ran out of money. She was at the Clinton Institute in New York. Her mother died. She was very depressed. She ran out of money. She couldn't pursue her education any further. She goes to New Jersey with friends of hers. They open their house. The Nortons say, come with us, have a vacation, live at our farm for a while, Well, she can't remain idle for long. She does go to Bordentown, New Jersey. She stays with her friends, and she notices in Bordentown, as she's walking through town, all these dirty, listless little street urchin boys hanging around on corners. And she's like, why aren't they in school? Okay. Well, there's no free public school in New Jersey because they tell her when she approaches the town fathers about starting a free public school, they're like, oh, forget it. These kids are more suitable for prison than they are the schoolroom. Free schooling is charity. Nobody likes it. She's very persistent. And she finally prevails upon the city fathers to give her this dilapidated building, which she sets up as a school. And she starts to recruit these kids. Not very successful yet. The school opens day one. She's got 6 boys. So she treats these kids like she treats all of her kids. She talks to them. She tells them stories, what interests them. She hooks them. In a week, there's like 20 kids coming to school. And then all of a sudden, in a couple of weeks, there's like 40 kids coming to school, and some little girls are also attending school. So she starts this free school experiment. It's highly, highly successful. And she also convinces the city fathers that they need to build another school. So they entail money for that, and they're going to build a school, and it's going to have room for like 500 or 600 kids. And so she's all happy. She feels successful. She feels fulfilled. She goes home to summer vacation in Massachusetts. She comes back to the new school, and the city fathers have said to her when she returns, she's flabbergasted, that a school so highly successful cannot be run by a woman. Wow. So they hire this incompetent guy, and they make her his assistant. Well, right off the bat, she is very, very unhappy. And he's very incompetent. And he ruins the school in a year. She is such a wreck. She has somewhat of a nervous breakdown. She probably has several nervous breakdowns during her lifetime.
I'd have a nervous breakdown about that too.
So what happens is she winds up losing her voice. That will happen frequently through her life in times of stress. She can't talk. She's a nervous wreck. She decides, that's it. I'm done. I'm just going to fold up shop. And she decides to go to Washington, D.C. Okay. Now, why? I'm not really sure. But she feels that I think she feels so strongly, she will never teach again as a profession. I mean, she will teach people, but she will never teach again as a profession. So she goes to D.C. Her distant cousin is a congressman. He introduces her around. She gets a room in a boarding house, not the famous 7th Street boarding house. She gets a room in a boarding house, and her cousin introduces her to Judge Mason, the patent office commissioner. Now, Judge Mason graduated from West Point in 1929, first in the class of 1929. Robert E. Lee was number 2 in the West Point class.
Oh, that Mason.
So that's Judge Mason. And he's really taken with her, and he's thinking to himself, maybe she'll be a great governess for my children. But then he thinks a little more about it, and he goes, no, I'm going to hire her for the patent office because she's going to make a dynamic clerk, and she certainly does. And when the judge decides there's too much corruption in the patent office, Clara Barton, teacher's pet, always does better with, people in authority and adults. And, as a child, that was her MO. Well, she becomes his pet, and she sniffs out all this corruption with these patent office people. And these men, it's a men's world, they really hate her. They spit tobacco juice on her hem, and they blow smoke in her face, and she's not budging. She's going to get equal pay for equal work, and nobody is going to dislodge her from her rightful job if she can help it. And so she's pretty good. She's got some problems because the Department of the Interior, the cabinet member for the Department of the Interior, doesn't believe in men and women working together in the same office. He calls it promiscuous employment. And so his name is McClellan, and he does everything he can to demote her or get rid of her. But Judge Mason's not budging. The men in the office do what we do today in high schools and offices everywhere. They try to slut shame her. Like, who is this woman working with men? And she's a loose personality. But she just doesn't budge, and she does a damn good job as in the patent office. But when Judge Mason takes a leave, McClellan, the Department of the Interior cabinet officer, he immediately demotes her. So she has her ups and downs in Washington, D.C., but that's why she comes to Washington. So she's in Washington when the war begins in 1861. And what really hooks her is that the 6th Massachusetts, boys from her area, come down to Washington, D.C. to defend the Capitol on, I think it was the 19th of April. Mm-hmm. And they're changing trains in Baltimore, and they're attacked by the plug uglies of Baltimore. You know, in Baltimore, you couldn't get a train to go straight through. You had to get off one train, walk through town, and then get on another train. And remember, Washington is a southern city, and it's surrounded, and Lincoln needs men to defend the city. So that's how the 6th Massachusetts gets down there. And they are attacked. 40 of them are wounded. 3 are killed, I believe. And the Capitol is in disarray, and there are no provisions for any soldiers or troops, and so they put them up in the Senate chamber. They just put them in the Senate chamber. It's
a big open room.
There's no food. There's no clothing. There's no supplies. So Clara Barton, her sister, and her landlady take things from their own homes, like anything they can, towels and soap and anything that they think a soldier might need, and they put it in baskets, and they go to the Senate chamber, and they distribute these. So humanitarianism, right from the beginning. Starts her career as a wartime humanitarian, even though we always think of her as a nurse. She really is a humanitarian, a supply organizer. So she goes down there, and the boys from Massachusetts, some of them actually remember her, and she's given a newspaper, and she sits in the Senate chamber at the head of the, where the vice president sits, the head of the Senate sits, and she reads the local Worcester Spy, I think it is, to the boys from Massachusetts. They all write home about her, and they tell their families, send supplies to Washington, D.C., to Miss Barton. So she starts collecting supplies for troops from Massachusetts, from her state. You know how how decentralized things are. If you're a Virginian or you're a Massachusetts person or you're a Connecticut person. So she starts collecting supplies for troops from Massachusetts, and then she branches out, and it becomes all of the boys in blues. Soon she has 3 warehouses. Her boarding house is a warehouse, and she's inundated with supplies from ladies groups and families who turn to her to get things distributed to their boys who need them. So that marks the very first Civil War service that she does as a wartime supply organizer.
So where does she get, I'm assuming, well, actually, let me back up if
Yeah.
you don't mind. So we talked about she's in Washington at least for a decade. Right?
Yes.
She moves there in the 50s.
Yeah.
The war obviously breaks out in the 60s.
Yeah.
Does she have any kind of social life? I mean,
Yes.
besides work, like, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she does have a social life. She mixes very well with political families from, but very northern oriented.
Okay.
She's an abolitionist. She makes no qualms about that. Washington is a divided city. So she socializes with, congressmen and their families. And so she has a very active social life.
Okay.
And
No truth to the rumors of the nasty rumors about being loose. Or whatever.
No, not at this point. She is a maiden lady by choice. She never wants to, and I don't believe I ever saw anything in her papers. I think she just never found the right person. And for her, she's extremely independent. Now remember, if you married in the 1850s, you gave over your whole person to your husband. Your legal and social identity is submerged with your husband. And I don't think she ever found anybody that she would give up everything for. She had suitors, but she wasn't really interested in being married.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's an interesting thing to say. She never found anyone she was willing to give up everything for.
Yeah, back in the day, right? That was the expectation.
Yeah, that's quite a statement. I like that. I like the way you word things.
Yeah, well, you know what? I can get very technical because there's something called the law of coverture. It's not a written law, but what happens when you marry, your property, your identity, everything, your children, you lose the right to everything. You give everything over to your husband. You don't have, if anything goes wrong, you don't have the right to any of your property. You don't have the right to the children of your body. You have no way to make a living apart from your husband. So you really take your identity and subsume it into your husband's identity. And we can see this even today when a woman signs a mortgage. Mm-hmm. She always signs second.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if she makes more than her husband or whatever. It's just like all these little vestiges. I like to look in the papers. Like I find my mom in the papers. My mother was the ultimate housewife. She belonged to the Altar Society and the Homemakers Club. And you know what? If you don't know people's first names and you're looking through papers from the 1960s, it always says Mrs. Donald Barron. Mm-hmm. Nowhere does her name say Mary Barron. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to research people. And I'll add one other thing. The very first time the federal Equal Credit Opportunity Act is passed, where a woman does not need a man co-signing for a loan or a credit card, is 1972.
Yeah. It's hard to believe, but it's within our lifetimes, basically. I mean, it's certainly, it's just amazing how.
Yeah. So she's very aware of this, and I don't think, and she's extremely independent. She can make a living. She makes a living, makes more money than most men working for the patent office, even after her demotion, which is very difficult for her. She will lose her job entirely when the Democratic administration comes in 56. And then when the Lincoln administration comes back in 1860, she's reinstated.
So I kind of got you off track there, and I apologize. Yep. But you were talking about her efforts to collect these supplies and things. Obviously, someplace had to be set aside for them to be stored and everything. And you mentioned at least 3 warehouses. Yep. Who provided those, or how did she get those? Or
she rented them.
Wow.
Now, who provided the money?
Wow.
It could have been money that she was collecting for the. It's hard to track finances in the 19th century because it's not like a nonprofit today where, money's encumbered and directed. And that alone was quite the accomplishment.
Sure, yeah.
But she really wants to do more. Now, in 62, the summer of 62, she receives word in Massachusetts, and the war is ramping up, okay? She's in Washington when the first casualties from Bull Run come in July. It's just horrible. So she goes through 1861 trying to do something. She goes to hospitals. She collects supplies, but she always wants to do more. In 1862, that summer, she receives words that her 82 or 85-year-old father is dying up in Massachusetts. She goes home to nurse him in his last illness. Now, she's really torn because as independent as she is, she doesn't feel like she can just go follow the army. Mm-hmm. Because that's not a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
She's very, very conscious that she has to appear to be whether she is or not, appearances are very important. Mm-hmm. She doesn't want to appear to be a radical. She doesn't want to just depart and do what she wants to do and go with the troops. She wants to continue to secure support for her mission. And so she's really torn. So she goes home to Massachusetts. She nurses her father. He speaks to her about this. He says, listen, I'm paraphrasing, you're the daughter of a soldier. I know soldiers. They'll respect your mission. It took a lot of guts to go off with the army and provide help in these hospitals. A maiden lady touching and nursing strange men among men. That was a pretty interesting. She's really torn about this, but her father gave his blessing, made her even more determined. She applied to the Surgeon General for a pass. She's not a fool. She applies to Surgeon General Hammond for a pass, and you can see a copy of this in the National Archives. And she wants his permission, his blessing. And he gives it. And so with this precious pass, she says, I broke the shackles and went into the field.
Oh, wow.
And she serves first at Cedar Mountain. She serves at Chantilly. Very exciting, terrible things happen. At Chantilly, Dr. James Dunn writes home to his wife that if ever a homely angel came to us, it was Miss Barton. And this letter gets published nationally in newspapers all over the nation about this homely angel, Clara Barton. Well, she doesn't like that. She's, we're used to seeing the Brady photo of her from 65, and she's got that determined look, and she was not considered very attractive. But when we look at that Brady photo, we're like, wow, she's really a determined lady. It's like there's nothing unattractive about her portrait at all. But so this homely angel does not like this, but she recognizes the publicity value of it. So she corrects it, according to her biographer, and she puts the holy angel of the battlefield, and that's where that angel of the battlefield comes from. It comes from a surgeon who she delivered supplies to that, he's got 1,000 wounded men on the field, out of supplies. Well, Antietam comes around. 1862, it's Antietam, and this is like the height. 1862 is really her crowded hour, and she is quite near the battlefield when the battle erupts. And she has Teamsters at her disposal because Quartermaster of the Army, Rucker, likes her, and he allows her to transport supplies with Army Teamsters and wagons or Army freight trains. So she wakes. She knows something's coming. So on the early morning, like 1:00 in the morning, she gets her Teamsters awake. And she gets them moving, and they catch up to the artillery that's heading toward Antietam. Because by now she's got enough experience to know if you want to get through with supplies, you've got to follow the guns. Mm-hmm. And she does. And she arrives on the field, and we don't know exactly where, Samuel Poffenberger or Joseph Poffenberger. She arrives on the field in the morning, and they're already out of every supplies. Mm-hmm. And it's Dr. Dunn and Dr. Cutter again, and they see her. Where'd you come from? How'd you get from Virginia so quickly? And she starts to supply them with everything she has. And a lot of really exciting things or terrible things happen at Antietam. She bends down to give a young man a drink of water, and a bullet goes through her sleeve and kills him instantly, and he dies in her arms. She does her first surgery. Now, she has no medical training, but there's this young kid laying in the field and, outside the barn, and he says, "You got to take this bullet out of my cheek. You've got to do it. You've got to do it." And she's like, "No."
I don't have to do anything.
So this other wounded guy decides to hold the guy down, and she takes her pocket knife. It's in the Library of Congress, I believe. I have a picture of it. She takes her pocket knife, she slits his cheek, and the bullet pops out. So she considers that her first surgery. She's the doctors come for her because there's a young boy that refuses all treatment. He's shot in the chest somewhere, presumably not fatally, and they can't do anything with this kid. They don't have time to mess around. So they get Miss Barton, and she's talking to the kid, and she's looking at this kid, and it doesn't look like a young man. Well, indeed, it was a young lady. Mm. And she had been wounded. She had followed her lover. And Barton protects her and shields her, gets her to Washington. And apparently the story goes that the two stayed together and named their first child Clara Barton after her. There is a story, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine just came out with a book on her. And it's a series of vignettes about her life and her service during
on the woman
Civil
or
War.
On Clara Barton?
On Clara Barton.
Okay.
And in that, they believe that the surgeon and Miss Barton changed the names of this couple to protect them. So they're unsure about what their identity was, but the name they gave was Mary Galloway. And but that doesn't turn out to be the young lady's name. But the story was verified by a second source who was a regimental surgeon. They both verified the story. So I guess we can presume that it's true.
Yeah, and that's why she was freaking out. It was in the chest.
Yeah.
It would have given her away.
Sure.
Anyway, so that's Civil War. It just goes on and on. She does remarkable things at Fort Wagner. She's not at Gettysburg. She's at Fort Wagner when the 54th Massachusetts makes its gallant charge, and she's very proud because they're black troops from her state. She does a lot of heroic things there. One of the things most people remember about, if you know Clara Barton, is that, she aids the wounded to the utmost of her ability after that horrific charge. She nurses black and white alike. And she has a very torrid affair with a white officer who her biographer says came as close as any to her ideal mate. She calls it her golden time with him. He's married, and she's not a house wrecker. And she knows she's not in it for a long haul, but they're, it's wartime, and they remain after their golden time. They remain lifelong friends. And here's a little footnote to history. When she serves in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, she is at her desk in 1898 in Cuba, and she's working alongside a group of people that she's brought with her to distribute humanitarian aid before the war even begins. They're at their desks the night the Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. And one of the men she's with is her lover's. He's dead. He died. His wife had died. Her lover's nephew, who she maintained relations with the family. And this kid served with her in the Red Cross in Cuba.
Now, does she talk about this man in her letters and diaries and stuff?
Yeah, it was pretty well known. Her brother was with her in South Carolina. They knew what was going on. Most people knew what was going on. I don't know if the wife knew what was going on. He always wanted her to meet his wife, John J. Elwell, but I think Barton declined. But like I say, they maintained.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Kind of a little freaky for her. You can read her. You can read her biography. Is really, really interesting. It was a different time. And, I do believe she was in love with him, but she wasn't a house wrecker. Right. He had 3 children that all died in infancy or very young, so he didn't have any direct descendants. But this nephew must have come in contact with her or him or, because in 1898, when she serves in Cuba, this man's nephew is by her side.
So, when we talk about quote-unquote affairs in 2023, immediately you think about a sexual affair, right? Like a physical affair.
Was.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
yeah. I
okay.
believe it was. Her biographer, I know we get off the beat, but it's so interesting to me. Her biographer believes, what is that? Am I doing something? So while Clara Barton is in South Carolina, we hear all this, I don't know.
I was like, are we trying to make
what is that?
A specific sound effect for this?
Now, what was I saying? Oh,
okay, we're going to go back, marking the end of that.
So yes, everybody believes, and I do believe it was a physical affair. The greatest of her life, the love of her life, and her biographer Elizabeth Brown Pryor, in her biography, claims that Barton was not afraid of becoming pregnant because she had gone through an early menopause, probably from all the stresses, and so she wasn't worried about getting pregnant, which was a big concern in the 19th century.
Sure.
And but anyway,
I still would have. Knowing what medical things they knew back then and didn't know, as somebody who has gone through fertility stuff, I'd still be afraid of that. I'd still think it would be. You never know.
You never know, but apparently she felt free and committed enough to have this affair. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to cheapen it or make it sound. I think it really was the love of her life. But that shouldn't negate all the great things she did in South Carolina. She worked with, she nursed, there was a big smallpox epidemic in South Carolina. Actually, it was nationwide. And she nurses all the victims of smallpox. She nurses the wounded. She works with the freed population who are, the government's supposed to be doing something for them, and they're starving. There's nothing for them. She works with the freed black population to, make sure that they can get on their feet. She does a lot of remarkable work in South Carolina, even though it's not like the exciting wartime service on the field that you saw at Antietam and Chantilly. But, I think we shouldn't let. I think it's part of life, and she had this affair, but she also accomplished great things in South Carolina for very, very many people.
I was just more fascinated with it because if the husband is the one encouraging, come meet my wife, to me that's a little bizarre. Mm-hmm. Unless it was just an emotional affair, kind of, like that kind of thing. But I could maybe understand it a little bit more, like he really cares about this woman, but nothing like.
untoward.
Yeah, right. Like nothing is like shameful or something. That's pretty ballsy to be like, hey, by the way, come meet my wife. Like I'd be like, I would say no too.
I think he cared for them both. I mean, he was probably. I mean, I don't know. Humans are so complex.
Sure, I get it.
I just don't. I'm just saying what I know about it and what was. Pryor wrote about it in her biography, Professional Angel. I just think humans are very complex, and you're talking about a woman who is so complex that I don't know how anybody can. Most biographies of her are either very negative. Donald fans, even though he gives her a lot of kudos for what she does, he dings her a lot for some of her exaggerations later in life. Pryor Brown, I think, is a little more objective, and we'll talk about negatives as well as the positives. And her, is it Oates, Stephen Oates? That biography, I just find it's just so laudatory that I didn't care for it because she is a highly complex, highly flawed individual that overcomes everything to accomplish great things.
I mean, obviously, her amazingness as what she did. Like, I've never heard of this episode. So, a lot of times women get dinged for any kind of impropriety that they do in their lives.
I call it slut shaming.
Yeah.
We do it today all the time.
Oh, 100%. And so the fact that we don't hear about it, we only hear about her service. Yeah. Obviously, even the people back then were like, listen, I don't care what she does as long as this help continues. Yeah. So that's pretty amazing that she overcame all of that as well.
Did you find that she was still struggling with depression or bouts of
very frequently? Let me talk about 1863. She does all these amazing things. It's her 1862 through 63, kind of her crowded hour. But don't forget, the Sanitary Commission, the Christian Commission are kicking into high gear, and they're assuming a lot of the functions that she was doing as an individual. So, a lot of her services are they do amazing things, don't get me wrong. But the one, as amazing as she is, one woman cannot do it all. And you have these great commissions kicking in, providing a lot of support for the troops and supplying the troops. So I think the end of 63 becomes a difficult time for her. And she starts to feel these, feelings of uselessness and inadequacy. She, by the end of the war, that's pretty much in high gear. I mean, she does think she manages a flying hospital for the 9th Corps and all this stuff. And she likes to be bold and in charge and big and in charge. And she doesn't like a lot of other women around, especially women who are horning in on her territory. So she has a lot of adjustments to make. And I think especially at the beginning, the end of 1864, beginning of 1865, I think very, very difficult times for her with regard to feelings of inadequacy and, I'm not needed anymore. And her brother is dying. She's nursing him. Her favorite nephew is dying at the beginning of 1865. And suddenly she is confronted with this new reality. Andersonville prison starts to open its gates and ship Union prisoners up to Annapolis. And her nephew, who I think he was there and he witnessed this, he comes back to D.C. and he says to her, Aunt Clara, there's a big need. These prisoners, it's like nothing you've ever seen before. You have to see this. It's just horrible. Somebody has to do something. Well, okay. She's going to do something.
When you're dragging ass out of bed, the hairs must up on your head. You picture the 20th Maine and you're happy once again. Fight the battle against being slow with Little Brown Top Bro.
Little Ground Top is addressing Gettysburg's first coffee brand, and we're proud to team up with Bantam Roasters to bring you this medium blend with notes of cacao, wildflowers, and toasted sugar. Get your bag in whole bean or grounded to your coffee making specifications. Find out for yourself why Bantam Roasters can't keep Little Ground Top on the shelves and is inundated with online orders each week. Go to addressinggettysburg.com/cafe or stop in at Bantam Roasters at 82 Steinware Avenue in Gettysburg. Fight the battle against being slow with Little Ground Top, bro. I mean, sis.
She goes to Annapolis. She sees this for herself. She also starts to realize that there are so many missing, like the vanished of the Civil War. The Army did not notify families when a soldier died in service or was killed in battle. Notification to families came through a company officer or a comrade. There's no central graves registration. I mean, this is hard for people in the 21st century to understand because people will actually say to me when I'm talking about her, no, sir, they know. How did families know what happened? Well, the reality of the 19th century Civil War years is that men vanished. Nobody knew their fate. Families grieved, and it really hits her hard. Throughout the war, she had kept, you can look at her diaries again in the Library of Congress, notes about names and places and dates and where people are buried and what hospital they die at. There's no system to her note-taking, but throughout her diaries, you can feel the compassion she has for families who lose these loved ones and never know their fate. So she writes to President Lincoln asking him if she can become a correspondent for missing soldiers. And she conceives this missing soldiers office. And Lincoln grants her request. He says, absolutely. President Johnson, after the assassination, will also grant her requests and support her. And she undertakes this mission to identify as many missing soldiers as possible. It's an amazing story. She will identify about 22,000. She gets about 60, her office processes about 66,000 pieces of correspondence in about 3 years. Remember, no typewriters, no computers, no. She pioneers the use of form letters. She's very determined that anybody who writes to her will get a response. She does all kinds of things. She opens the missing soldiers office in her boarding house,
which is
she's
now a museum.
Now a museum on 7. That's another amazing story. And she does a lot of good work. Many of the men, of course, that she identifies, quote unquote, are from Andersonville because Dorrance Atwater, the young Connecticut soldier who had been captured and taken to Andersonville, has a beautiful handwriting, and they tap him as a clerk in the doctor's office in the dispensary or clinic of Andersonville. All he does is keep lists of the dead. And he manages to smuggle a duplicate list that he had made out when he is paroled. And so they identify about 13,000 of the Andersonville dead. Marked grave, marked plot. About 400 were left unidentified. Wow. And she does have a national monument at Andersonville National Cemetery. So in honor of her work. So she has a monument there. She has a monument at Antietam Battlefield. It's at the Joseph Poffenberger farm. She probably was at Samuel, but she...
At least it's there.
At least it's at a Poffenberger.
The government owned the land where the monument is, so that's where they put it. And she has 3 museums dedicated to her. So this missing soldier's office is so intriguing. It's remarkable.
Mm-hmm. The building itself is insanity.
Yeah.
Have you ever been there?
No.
It's so worth a trip.
Yeah.
And it's not a lot by any stretch of the imagination, but you can really see it.
She was on the 3rd floor. She had that little corner walled off that became her bedroom. The office was most of the front facing 7th Street on the 3rd floor. And she had no running water. There was gas lighting. If you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had to go 3 floors down to the privy or the outhouse in the courtyard. This is 19th century. And every time I walk up those stairs, that dark flight of stairs, do you know how many things she carried up those stairs over the years that she lived there?
I barely carried myself up those stairs.
So I always think of her in her dress and her, and coming. Oh, that is where that boarding house is where she came home from Antietam with typhoid fever. She had typhoid in that bill. It's remarkable. The reason it was lost for so many years is after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City. That horrific fire and all those young immigrant girls were killed hurling themselves out of the factory building because the exits were blocked and there was no fire escapes. Fire law all over the nation is transformed, basically. And many landlords, not just in Washington, but all over, who didn't want to put any money into their old buildings simply sealed off the top floors. And that's what happened to her missing soldier's office. And in 1996, the government is going to demolish the building, and it's been sealed up for years, untouched, sealed up. And Richard Lyons is government inspector and carpenter, and he goes up there. He's checking out the building. He's got a flashlight. It's the day before Thanksgiving, and he's going through the building, making sure there's no homeless sleeping there, or when they're getting ready to demolish it. He gets up to the 3rd floor, and you can see the story online. It's pretty remarkable. He winds up in the room that is her bedroom, that little walled-off room, and there's a hatch in the room, and he gets a ladder, and he's going to go up to the hatch. He's not going to go through it. He starts feeling around. And, he finds a letter to her landlord who he doesn't know who the hell the landlord, Edward Shaw, is. But Shaw has a very close relationship with Barton. And then he's feeling around, and he feels this piece of metal, and he pulls it down. And it's this very famous Clara Barton missing soldier's office sign that used to be on the door. Wow. And so he knows he's struck something. And so he goes on a crusade to save the building and learn about Clara Barton. It's said in a couple of interviews he did find a dress up there with a hole in the sleeve. You wonder if that was the Antietam dress. I mean, who knows? Yeah. But it is a very remarkable save of a very historic structure.
And thank God he knew his history.
A very remarkable, well, he certainly knew the name Clara Barton.
Yeah. I mean, if he had just not paid attention that day in history class, that building would be gone.
Yeah. That's really wild.
So I want to talk about a couple of things. I don't know how much time, because I'll just babble on, and I don't know how interesting I am or whatever.
Somewhat,
so you need to interrupt me. And then when I start gesturing and moving around, you have to stick that microphone in my face. But I want to talk about a couple of things during the Civil War years. She's always considered a nurse, and she certainly does nurse. But she's not a nurse. And in fact, I read an interview with Jake Wynn that he was at the missing soldiers office for a couple of years, part of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and they try to emphasize she was not a nurse. Did she nurse? Absolutely. But she really was more of a wartime supply organizer, humanitarian, it just did a lot of remarkable things. Well, why wasn't she a nurse? Well, first of all, the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, which she founded, does not want her to be called a nurse because she was never trained. She never went through any training programs. And in fact, in the 19th century, there was no nursing profession. It's the Civil War that makes the nursing profession as we know it today, a trained group of female nurses. So let's talk about that for a second. So she wasn't a nurse. She was not trained, although she did nurse, as thousands of volunteer and federal female employees did indeed nurse. But what was nursing? It was palliative care. It was taking care of patients, comforting people, writing letters. But I will make a remark that everywhere women went in the Civil War, whether they were wanted or not, and many officers and hospitals did not want female nursing staff, everywhere women went, volunteer and paid nurses went in the Civil War, survival rates increased. Why? Because what do women do? They comfort men. They keep everything clean. They wash clothes. They cook good food. They do the things that women did in the 19th century, and it benefited these wounded men. And these wounded men are never, ever going to forget these nurses. So, 19th century, there's no nursing profession. If you are arrested for prostitution before the Civil War in New York City, often they will give you three choices, and one is to pay a fine, which nobody had. The other is to go to jail, which most of them did. And your third choice in New York City was you could work off your sentence by nursing at Bellevue Hospital. And none of them wanted to do that. Ironically, in 1873, Bellevue will institute the first true training program for female nurses, 1873. Elizabeth Blackwell did have during the war, Elizabeth Blackwell did have I think it was like 4-week training program for nurses, and mostly it was indoctrination into, the smells, the sights, what would happen when these nurses got there. Was not really a nurses training program, but something to acclimate them to the horrible, horrible circumstances that they would enter as nurses in a Civil War hospital. So she's not a nurse because the Red Cross says she's not a nurse, but she nurses. So nurse, not a nurse. She to support the missing soldiers office, she prevails upon Congress. Now this woman can't vote. She has no famous family. She has no fortune, but she really gets things done. She gets Congress to support the missing soldiers office with $15,000 that is soon expended. Some people are like, well, what does she do with all that money, Well, listen, she lives frugally, very frugally, her entire life. She doesn't do anything extravagant. She winds up trying to support the missing soldiers office by going on this lecture circuit. So how did you make money in the 19th century? If you had to make money and had no money, but you had something to peddle, like a reputation or great deeds or a literary book. So great men go on the lecture circuit. Mark Twain, Frederick Douglass, Emerson. Well, Clara Barton goes on the lecture circuit. She does make money. For the first time in her life, she becomes independent financially, and she's supporting the soldiers' office. She talks about Andersonville, and she talks about being in service during the Civil War, and she hates it. She hates it, but she keeps doing it because she's trying to support. And in 1868 in Boston, she has one of her famous nervous breakdowns, and she loses her voice entirely. She just falls apart, and the doctors tell her, you need a long vacation. She decides to go to Europe because one of the wounded Union soldiers at her missing soldiers office who worked for her, Jules Gollet, has family in Switzerland. And he says, I know where you should take a vacation. Go to my family in Switzerland. And while she's in Switzerland, she's a notable woman, and several men call on her because most of Europe has signed something called the Geneva Convention. And the Red Cross has become a reality in European warfare. Okay, so Europe signs the Geneva Convention, and I believe they signed it in 1862, but the United States, the Lincoln administration, declined to get involved in any of that. I guess the Lincoln administration response was, Europe, you stay on your continent, and we will stay on ours. Typically isolationist. And so she has a bunch of prominent gentlemen callers who say to her, Miss Barton, why didn't the United States sign the Geneva Convention? And she goes, I wasn't there. I have no idea. And they say, well, she goes, I don't even know what the Red Cross is. Well, she finds out pretty quick. And then during the Franco-Prussian War, she works for the Red Cross, and she wears the Red Cross badge in Europe, and she works with civilian populations. And she will wear that badge for the rest of her life. She comes home to the United States. It takes her about 10 years.
This wasn't much of a vacation.
No, it wasn't much of a vacation.
No, this sounds like she went to a different country to do the same thing.
She did indeed. But that's how she will say at the end of her life, by helping others, I help myself. And it really was an antidote. Helping others, working herself to the bone, doing all this humanitarian relief work was really an antidote for what ailed her. And
can I interrupt again?
Yeah.
I apologize.
No, just ask questions.
So she's doing this fundraising for the missing soldiers office, which presumably is still in operation.
She's going to close it when she goes to Europe.
Okay, so she didn't have staff that kept it going?
No, not without her.
Okay, and I'm so sorry. When did you say she went to Europe?
1868.
Oh, okay, so it was open for a handful of years.
Three and a half, about, 3.5. I got to remember to talk into this bloody thing that Matt put an X on.
Okay, thanks.
X marks the spot. So anyway, it takes her about 10 years, and the first thing she does is she starts an education campaign for the American public. And what is the Red Cross and why we should have it in America? She recruits a lot of veterans to her side because veterans experience
they get it
firsthand. She goes to a lot of powerful people. Senator Wilson, who was her advocate during the war from Massachusetts, becomes vice president under Ulysses Grant. She makes a lot of powerful friends. The Hayes administration declines to even the Geneva Convention has to be a treaty. Only the Senate can ratify a treaty under the Constitution. Rutherford B. Hayes administration refuses to do anything with the treaty, will not bring it to the Senate, just wants nothing to do with it. She keeps pounding away through the halls of Congress. Again, woman who cannot vote, maiden lady, no family or fortune, just keeps pounding away. She gets President Garfield, to commit to bring the treaty to the Senate for ratification. However, Garfield is assassinated. And Chester A. Arthur, who becomes president after him, reassures Miss Barton that President Garfield was committed to the treaty. I will be too. Now that I am president, I will bring it to the Senate for ratification. He does indeed, and he in 1881 the United States becomes the last major nation to sign the Geneva Convention.
So she's in her
60s. So she's in her 60s. And the American Red Cross is born. She immediately becomes president, and she immediately starts taking steps to reconfigure the Red Cross into what she believes it should be. And that means, and that's the Red Cross that we have today. The Red Cross is not to just be for times of warfare. Where there is a need, we will supply the help. She starts to have the Red Cross go to all kinds of natural disasters, fires, flood, famine, and she goes with it to, now this is a 60-year-old woman. She starts to travel the world as head of these relief organizations. The International Red Cross is so impressed with what the American Red Cross is doing under Clara Barton that in the International Convention, Barton is sent by the Secretary of State, Fessenden, I think it was. Frelinghuysen, don't quote me on the name. She becomes a female representative from the United States to a foreign delegation. She attends the International Red Cross, and they are so impressed with what the American Red Cross has done under Barton that they adopt the American Amendment to the International Red Cross. And the Red Cross becomes what she envisioned, an organization that helps in all conditions, not just wartime, war and peace, all natural disasters. Anywhere help is needed by humanity, the Red Cross should be there.
That's really cool.
So, yeah, in a lot of ways, the second half of her life from 1881 when she turned 60 is a whole new career, a whole new trajectory, and probably more important to us in the present than her very exciting Civil War work was. When we read about it and we think of the heroine of the battlefield and all of this, but it's the second half of her lifetime, actually not really, because she's really entering old age by age 60. She's definitely a senior citizen. It's really important to us today because what we know of as relief efforts and disaster prevention, not prevention, you can't prevent a disaster, but preparedness really spring from her management of the American Red Cross.
Which I find so fascinating. Now, only because I've read books about her did I know that there was a separation there between the Civil War and the American Red Cross. But when I was talking to people that I know about doing this today, they all assumed it was at one time.
Yeah.
And I find that so fascinating because it was a 20-year gap.
A long struggle, a huge, huge struggle where I don't know how she kept that forward momentum. But again, her ability to network, her ability to get powerful men to aid her causes, her visions, because these were visions. They were not conceived before. And with the American Red Cross, she really, again, the European Red Cross, the Geneva Convention was all for, it was all about wartime relief. And her vision is bigger, deeper, and she sees it through.
You know, the whole time you've been talking, I always think there's this woman who will remain nameless since we're on a podcast, who I grew up knowing, who was a friend of my mom's that worked at the hospital. And she was one of those women. She was older. So when I knew her, she was probably in her 60s, maybe late 60s, early 70s. And she was that one woman that everybody, like, when she walked in the room, everyone was like, oh my God, why? But they did what she wanted her to do, and she had a plan, and you did not go outside of that box unless you wanted this woman to be like, and why are you doing that? Yeah. And this is what this reminds me. I wish I had that personality. I wish I could go into a room and just be like, no, this is what we're doing.
She wasn't like that, though. She was... the people close to her literally revered her. She makes I don't know if she makes a statement or her biographer makes a statement. She was everybody's maiden aunt.
Aw.
She really was. She doted on people. She again, her friendships become lifelong relationships. They go through generations because, again, she's much younger than her brothers and sisters who all predecease her. Her entire family of contemporaries predecease her. Many of her contemporaries predecease her. So she's got her nieces, her nephews, her much younger friends, her followers, but I don't want to say followers so much, but the people that she relies on. By the time she's 90 years old and dying in 1912 are much, much younger than her, but they are devoted to her. It's not like, oh my God, here she is again. I don't believe it was ever like that.
That's awesome, because she got a lot done for not... You know, like, there's some people that you have almost like two separate types of people. You have the ones that you're like, why? But then you have the ones that you're like, oh, we'll do it because we love you. Yeah. But it's not as nearly as urgent, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So she had to have some combination of both of those things.
She was charismatic. And she was, I said, a radical. She was really tight with Susan B. Anthony and
Dorothea Dix.
No, she didn't. They don't.
Oh no, they were not friends.
They were not friendly. They knew each other. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony especially tried to recruit Clara Barton so many times to the women's suffrage movement, but Barton stood aside because she knew if she got pulled in, and she was really pro-suffrage. Her mother had been before her, but she knew if Susan B. Anthony pulled her in, then her own causes would suffer. The other thing she worried about, even though she was absolutely pro-women's suffrage, was the fact that she made a career out of getting people to do things by bringing them into the fold. And women's suffrage was very controversial. And she didn't want anything to imperil her support for the Red Cross and what she was doing with that. She was a real radical. She was a dress reformer, if you know, like, but she would never wear it. Not publicly, because that was just like Mary Walker would go in her bloomer outfit, and she'd be arrested everywhere for wearing men's clothes. And of course, her response was, "I'm not wearing men's clothes. I'm wearing my clothes." But you don't gain any traction that way, especially if you have bigger causes that you want to move forward. And I think if she let the radical side of herself run free, she would have never, and she knew this, she would have never been able to accomplish all that she did. She would have never had the support that she did from all walks of life, the veterans. But you know what? She would draw the line. She is invited to a veterans reunion after the Spanish War. Now, remember, she served in the Civil War. She served in the Spanish-American War, under Red Cross in Spanish-American War. She's invited to this reunion, this veterans reunion, and they're all gaga because Miss Barton is coming, and she walks up there and she's introduced as, and I'm going to paraphrase terribly, she's introduced by a veteran as, and this is Miss Barton, and she's not one of those ladies that, want suffrage and all. She's a good lady, and look what she did for the soldiers. Well, she gets up there and she goes to those veterans, and she brings down the house, and she starts to hammer away about how you know what you owe women, you know what you owe these women. Every one of you should basically kiss Susan B. Anthony's ass, and, basically, and she brings down the house. So she was only going to go so far with that. She was willing to sublimate her more radical nature, but she would draw the line at that. And the other thing she drew the line at was equality for blacks and women. She goes to another veterans reunion, and there's an issue with black veterans, and she's not having any of that. So, she would stand on her principles, and she would get on her high horse. But again, she'd bring everybody along with her. So instead of alienating the crowd, she'd tell them why it was important that they do the right thing. And almost always they did.
Where is she buried?
She's buried up in her hometown in Oxford, Massachusetts. And she's buried with her family. And it's just about a mile or so from her birthplace, which is also a museum, and a very fascinating museum. It's pretty remarkable. So she has a family plot, and she's got something of an obelisk, and it's topped by a red cross, and there's a tablet there. She dies in Glen Echo, Maryland, at the Red Cross headquarters she built. It's built, she does a lot of good work at Jamestown after the flood. In fact, they must talk about her in schools in Jamestown, because a couple of times when I was at Unity Park doing the missing soldiers office, I would have kids. I had two kids at two different occasions say, why isn't there a statue to her in Jamestown? So they must talk about her good work at Jamestown, because kids are aware of that.
Johnstown or Jamestown? I'm sorry. Okay, no.
That's totally me.
Yeah,
no, thank you for interrupting. No, yeah, I'll say the wackiest things.
No.
I don't even know. It is Johnstown.
Wow.
So she's there at the Johnstown flood. Definitely worth going.
I haven't been in a long time, but yeah, I don't remember mention of her, but it could be because I haven't been there in 20 years. But
we went. We talked about her in school quite a bit. I'm from Western PA.
Yes.
Not in Johnstown, but from Western PA. We talked about her all the time.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
So anyway, she builds this huge warehouse in Johnstown. She's the first working train into Johnstown after the flood. She's on it, and her relief workers are on it, and her supplies are on it. The first train in. And she builds this huge warehouse. She's not wasteful, and she's gives people jobs because she believes, teach a man to fish and they'll eat forever, So she's not so much into, basic charity as much as moving things forward. Yeah. So she builds this huge, and she has, after the emergency is over, she has it dismantled. And she has all the lumber shipped to Glen Echo, Maryland. Somebody has given her property there. And she re-erects that warehouse. I mean, she changes the form. It looks like a steamboat or whatever. They call it a steamboat look. I don't know. And she has that building re-erected there, and that becomes Red Cross headquarters and her home. She has a habit of living where she works because it's a lot cheaper.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so she's frugal to the end. She milks her own cows out there. She loves animals. She has her horses and everything out there. She will die there on April 12th, 1912. I think that's the Titanic day, if I'm not mistaken. Her nephew boxes her up, puts her in her coffin, puts it on the stairs of Glen Echo, and many dignitaries come from Washington for the wake. They box her up, and they take her back home to Massachusetts, and they bury her. There is a picture of her casket on the stairs at Glen Echo with many dignitaries around it. So she lives a life, it's many lives in the space of her 90 years. She reinvents herself many times. In a world where women don't have careers, she has many careers, any of which would have made a man famous or maybe rich. But she is quite the remarkable personality. And again, her conception of what the Red Cross should be and what disaster relief should be really is what we know today. I mean, the Red Cross has gone through many, many iterations since then. It's not a one-woman show. Now we have chapters. It's very decentralized. We have chapters all over the nation, all over the world. But she's really onto something. And her life and her legacy. Let me talk just briefly about this. How does she affect us today? Well, she is head of the Red Cross, president of the Red Cross, for 23 years. Wow. In 1903, I think, she's there's a New York socialite that has ambitions to bring her down. It's a very sad story. And the more I learn about it, the more disgusted I am by it. So she's a New York socialite, Maud, what the heck is her name? She's tied into all of the great families of New York, and, she's a socialite, the best of everything. Her gowns come from Worth of Paris, and she's a fundraiser. She spends her entire life fundraising for all kinds of causes, and she sets her eyes on the Red Cross. And she has ambitions basically to bring down Barton. She is convinced that there's no way Clara Barton can exist without graft, and she must be skimming from the Red Cross. Now, this is a woman who gets her gowns from Worth in Paris. They have summer homes. They're used to going to Newport, and they're used to, Long Island, and just the best of the best, the robber barons. She has Barton investigated and finds that she inherited a minuscule amount when her father died in 1862. Well, nobody can exist on that. So she must be dirty. Not taking into account, because this is inconceivable to her, that Barton is remaking her old dresses and living quite frugally And, going from disaster to disaster, mostly because if Barton went somewhere like Jamestown, the money would pour in. Yeah. It was a very personal thing. So this woman makes it her mission to bring down. And Barton is she finally winds up having Barton investigated by the Senate. And it's like today, only the sensational stuff gets
out there.
reported.
Yeah.
The senator who's head of the committee is so outraged. This is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. Barton ultimately is totally exonerated. But she's had enough, and she resigns. But she's not done yet. She decides to do something called the First Aid Association of America. And she decides that first aid applied in the home or on the spot will save more lives than the Red Cross ever could. So they start with these first aid kits, and they start to train people. Put a first aid kit together. Put, all this first aid training. Now, who doesn't have a first aid kit in the house? Who doesn't have a first aid kit in the boat or the car? Well, this is the first aid that she founds in 1905. And along with this, that part of this first aid mission is ambulance corps, having an ambulance service in a community and all of this. So that impacts us directly today. Mm-hmm. And we all know, well, the Red Cross is watching all this. And this is why we associate this with the Red Cross, although Barton really founds this separately. Well, the Red Cross is watching all this and saying, that should be our mission. So Barton does not even put up a fight because she's still burned from the whole Senate investigation and the resignation. So she just give the Red Cross everything. Mm-hmm. So, but they take it and they use it. And what do we know of the Red Cross today? It's training. It's, it's first aid. It's all these training programs. It's resuscitation. And, all this, I think, is something we should attribute to her. It's iterated 1,000 times since she, founded these first aid kits in 1905, but part of our life today. And the other thing that I really want to talk about is this missing soldiers office and the DPAA, Department of POW MIA, and it's a Defense Department subset. And this department goes all over the world today, trying to identify the unidentified dead from the wars of the 20th century. The World War II, Korea, the Mideast, Vietnam, and I hear them in the news all the time. Mm-hmm. They just brought, about 6 months ago, they just brought an unidentified Korean War missing in action, killed in action, home to Seymour, Connecticut, and he was buried with full military honors in a local cemetery. So she's part of the reason we all believe today that our servicemen who sacrifice are should all be entitled to an honorable burial, an identified burial. And so that's something that I think every one of us is aware of, and none of us would argue with, and mm-hmm. all of us would applaud. And that is a direct response to her missing soldiers office work during the Civil War.
Can you imagine having done that much in your lifetime?
No.
No.
No. And especially in an environment, in an age when odds were kind of stacked against women to do those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can talk about her. Of course, I think of all these crazy little stories about her. I'm not always sure I'm tracking. So I'm glad when you interrupt and you ask questions. And but that really brings us to the end of a remarkable life. She's the most decorated woman in the 19th century. She receives medals and decorations from all of the European nations, but the United States never recognizes her with a medal. Now we all think about Mary Walker and the Medal of Honor, and she's a very different personality than Mary Walker. I mean, they are like night and day. I'm more of a Barton fan, to tell you the truth, because Barton, she gets things done, and that's the proof of the pudding. Mm-hmm. It's what you leave behind, what you get done, what you really accomplish for me.
But it's amazing. Like, you've been talking for an hour and 45 minutes, and I'm telling you, I knew none of this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew the Red Cross, and I knew Civil War nursing. I say in air quotes, but none of that.
Right.
It's insanity.
So you mentioned 3 museums, and I must have missed one. I know you mentioned the hometown birthplace.
Right. Is
that an NPS site or just a state run?
No, it's kind of quasi private.
Oh, okay.
It's attached to Barton tradition. There is a camp right next door to it. It's on the property of this camp, and it's teaching kids about how to live with diabetes.
Oh, wow.
Juvenile diabetes. Yeah. And that's it's right next door. It's a big part of if you go on the website for the Birthplace Museum, you will see this, a camp associated with it. It's a really interesting construct. And then there's the Missing Soldiers Office in Washington, D.C., and then there is the National Historic Site, which is Glen Echo, Maryland.
Okay.
Let me say something about Glen Echo.
I know where this is going.
We just recently went back there. I stop by frequently, okay? A few years ago, now we went there, I think we went there in the early 2000s. The place was furnished the way she would have had it furnished. We had a remarkable tour. They talked about her. It was really a great experience. They removed almost all of the artifacts and furniture to, I guess, to redo it or
it was a rehab
renovate
project.
or rehab or whatever. Nothing is back there. Now, we've been back periodically. And I was just there about 3 months ago, and it is in shocking disrepair. The yard is unkept. The paint it looks derelict.
Oh, wow.
And I know the National Park Service is under a tremendous amount of pressure for lack of funding and lack of manpower. But when I go there and I read the sign, this is a monument to a heroine of the United States, and I look at it, it looks decrepit. It's in shocking shape. Maybe structurally it's sound, but when you look at it from the outside, it is just I think it's a national tragedy.
We wanted to take a group
manned,
there,
right? It's just a site. It's not manned.
Apparently it's manned.
Wow.
They're supposed to have visiting hours. Nobody was there when we were there. And I've talked to a couple of people who have gone back since I've said something, and they said, well, it was supposed to be open, and it wasn't open.
Yeah, I don't think it's technically open. When we were going to do for her 200th birthday, we did a tour and went around to different sites that were important to her life, and we wanted to go to Glen Echo. And when we called down there, they were like, you can't go in the building. It's not safe.
There are hours posted outside on the porch.
Isn't that interesting?
But I looked at when you, again, the grounds are, and it's not a lot of grounds because it's just there's the park and the parking lot below, and you get out of the car and you look up at the house. There's not a lot of grounds to keep, but it's just really shockingly,
wow.
As I said, the whole place looks derelict.
Yeah. there has to be something more going on there. I just don't know what the story is.
No, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know either.
And for folks that want to learn more, obviously you mentioned Pryor's book.
Yep.
Angel, what was it? Professional Angel.
Professional Angel.
Okay.
That I would recommend. Donald Fans he just wrote one about her Civil War service. Now, he's not a Clara Barton fan. She doesn't come off badly in the book. Here's what I want to say. When she's on the lecture circuit, and the older she gets, she starts to, like, you know how we all do when we get old, your memory, and you start to tell stories, they might get more exciting or you might exaggerate a little. Well, of course she does this. I mean, I think that's a pretty human thing to do. And she's there to fundraise. You know, she's got nothing if she can't convince people to support her. So I don't hold her terribly responsible for that because, you know, who would accuse Frederick Douglass of exaggerating about slavery on the lecture circuit if, you know, he's there to support abolition and free blacks and education? You know, I think that some of that is just a typical human evolution as we get older. Did she misrepresent? I believe she did at times, but I don't think it was egregious. And
probably not self-serving.
Yeah. Well, it might have been self-serving because she needed that support again. But Fans dings her for that. But overall, I think the book is a really good book. So I would recommend that one, and I would recommend the Professional Angel.
And then lastly, Carolyn, obviously you portray Miss Barton. Do you have is there like a specific YouTube channel or anything that you can refer folks to, or is it through the Confederation of Union Generals primarily, or would there be resources like different?
I know that I have two formal programs associated with Barton, and I do portray her for the Confederation of Union Generals, and that's pretty ad hoc. It's like meet the public, explain your personality. But I have two programs. One is her Life and Legacy program, which is the full span of her life and accomplishments. And the other I have that I did for the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable. And, I think they might have taped it. That was the Missing Soldiers Office.
Perfect.
And there are YouTube versions of, I believe, both of the programs.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
This has been fascinating.
Did I talk you all to death?
No, this is wonderful.
Who's going to turn that YouTube off after 5 minutes?
No.
This is great. Thank you so much.
I had a really good time. I always have a good time talking to you guys.
Well, thank you. We love when you come on. I mean, you're just a wealth of information about
I know.
I'm really into it. You know, I don't think I'm so much of a wealth of information. It's very enthusiastic, and I'm always willing to learn more, and I do learn more every day.
Yeah.
So.
And I think what makes it nice to have you come on here is that you are so passionate about it. And for a long time, I was sitting here going, I have nothing to say because she's just, I love that when I don't have to do anything.
Well, thank you.
You just make it so easy.
You. Waving my hands and not talking into the X marks the spot.
It's okay. He put that on there specifically because of me, so it's totally fine.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you guys.
And
so good to see you all.
Yes, and thank you so much to everybody listening. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
That's What She Said was created by Amy Welsh and is hosted by Bethany Yingling and Veronica Brostensky, Esquire, produced by Matt Callery, and recorded at the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
Oh, I long to see you, lover, and beloved once at home. But I'll never leave our banner till in honor I can come. Tell the traitors all around you that their cruel words we know. In every battle kill our soldiers by the help they give the foe. Farewell, mother, you may never press me to your breast again. But oh, you'll not forget me, mother, if our number will sleigh.